So good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce this second session and our three participants. I think that we'll hear the three talks and keep the question for the end, if it's okay with you. It will. Okay, so we'll start with very Reverend John Pantalemon Manusakis. That's you. Are you the first?
I think I'm first.
On my list, you're the second, but
it doesn't matter.
Do you, if you prefer,
Do you want me to go first? Okay.
So, you start?
I guess.
Okay, so Charles Stang is assistant professor of early Christian thought at Harvard Divinity School. His research centers on ascetical and mystical theologies of Eastern Christianity, and specifically on the rise of negative theology. His book on Dionysius the Areopagite will be available in early 2012 through Oxford University Press. And his talk is on the negative ontology of evil. Please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I want to thank Christoph for inviting me, and Marav for everything, and for Gabby for hosting us. It's nice to meet new people here in Jerusalem and to meet old friends too, including John here, who, despite the fact that we live in the same city, I haven't seen in 10 years. So it takes Jerusalem to bring us into the same room. My topic today is the negative ontology of evil in three Neoplatonists. The first two, Plotinus and Proclass, are so-called pagan philosophers, Plotinus from the 3rd and Proclass from the 5th centuries. The third thinker goes by the name of Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, an early 6th century Christian inheritor of pagan Neoplatonism, who wrote under the name of Paul's famous convert from Acts 17. All three thinkers wrestle with the problem of evil and attempt to discern where evil fits, or indeed does not fit, into their general ontology, what we might call the story of being. The short answer, of course, is that evil cannot fit into their general ontology, that evil cannot occupy a discrete place in the great chain of being, but remains somehow outside, apart, something that is not a thing, nor even is, but quite literally haunts ontology. None of these thinkers is famous, principally, for what they have to say about evil. On the contrary, they're better known for what they have to say, or perhaps unsay, about the first principle, the ineffable one of Plotinus and Proclass, or the triune God of Dionysius. For all three thinkers, this divine first principle is beyond being, transcends being even as it gives being, and remains silent even as it calls beings into being. But all three are equally unwilling to have this transcendent first principle, this transcendent divinity, spiral off into obsolescence. And all three insist that the practice of philosophy and theology is the means of soliciting an intimate encounter with the one or the God beyond being, an encounter variously described as union, synergy, or unknowing. What interests me in their handling of the problem of evil is that in their efforts to give some account of evil's peculiar non-being, they all come very close to equating evil with the transcendent first principle and its peculiar non-being. Another way of putting this is to say that just as they insist that neither God nor evil fall within general ontology, that neither God nor evil, strictly speaking, exists, so they lose their ability to distinguish sharply between God and evil. The parallel between God and evil is at times rather striking, and for some, unsettling. What I propose to do is sketch out what this parallel looks like, this parallel between God and evil in each of our thinkers. Since Plotinus and Proclass take very different tacks on the problem of evil, and our Christian thinker Dionysius follows Proclass, we can, for convenience's sake, sketch out what this parallel between God and evil looks like in two rather than three distinct cases. For those of you who are not familiar with Plotinus, he wrote a series of essays or short treatises which his student Porphyry posthumously organized into 6 enneads, or nines. The essay I'll be speaking about today is one to which Porphyry gave the name On What Are and Whence Comes Evils, Ennead 1:8. When Plotinus inquires into evil, or for that matter, when he inquires into anything, he first consults his master, Plato. While one would be hard-pressed to find a theory of evil per se in the Platonic corpus, there are a handful of relevant remarks scattered throughout the dialogues, remarks that serve for Plotinus and other faithful followers of Plato as the parameters within which any subsequent inquiry must proceed. By far and away, the most important passage from Plato dealing with evil is found in the Theaetetus, and this passage is on your handout. It is not possible, Theodorus, that evil should be destroyed, for there must always be something opposed to the good, nor is it possible that it should have its seat in heaven. But it must inevitably haunt human life and prowl about this earth. That is why a man should make all haste to escape from heaven to earth. And escape means becoming as like God as possible. And a man becomes like God when he becomes just and pure with understanding. This is the principal text with which Plotinus thinks when he inquires into evil in Ennead 1:8. I wish to focus on his handling of 2 issues in this passage. 1, why evil is necessary, and 2, how exactly evil is opposed to the good. In order to answer the first question, we'll have to rehearse in broad brushstrokes the basic structure of Plotinian metaphysics, according to which the universe, or the all, is constituted as a series of eternal emanations from the first principle, the one, to its furthest extremity, matter, or ήλη. The ineffable one emanates first mind, or nous, and then soul, psyche, and together these 3 immaterial hypostases constitute a divine triad. I speak of first and second emanations, although Plotinus insists that they are not chronological or sequential, but rather eternal and simultaneous. Although these emanations are eternal, they remain, in a sense, distinct, and beings can ascend from lower to higher through concentrated contemplative effort, which is precisely what Plotinus was teaching his students to do. The first principle, the ineffable one, is also called the good and the beautiful, and is, strictly speaking, beyond being. That is, it exceeds being, and in fact gives being in the form of the second hypostasis, mind. This is the emergence of the intelligible realities or forms, and for Plotinus, everything that is more or less intelligible, and everything intelligible must exist. Plotinus envisions philosophy as an exercise of homecoming, that is, training the human soul and mind to ascend from its clouded embodiment to its proper divine heights. At the peak of this ascent, the human mind, or nous, would ascend beyond itself to the ineffable one, and thus, in effect, cease to exist, that is to say, would taste what lies beyond being. Regarding evil, Plotinus is in a bit of a bind. If evil exists, then it owes its existence, as all beings do, to the ineffable one, which is also the good. Then the good would be the author of evil, which seems contradictory. But if evil exists and has another author, then the one would have a rival, an opposite one, and Plotinus would be forced to concede to some sort of metaphysical dualism along the lines of Manichaeism. 2 options present themselves. 1, while he can't deny the existence of evils, he can deny evils their existence. 2, while he can't very well have 2 ones, he can suggest that the one necessarily brings forth its evil counterpart. I'll explain. Let's return to the question of the necessity of evil. In a sense, Plotinus resolves the impasse by appeal to another Platonic dialogue, the Timaeus, in which Plato describes how the demiurge creates the world by using intelligible forms to mold or shape recalcitrant matter, the eternal substrate that is without form. He writes, and again this is a quote on your handout, "How then is it necessary that if the good exists, so should evil? Is it because there must be matter in the all? This all must certainly be composed of contrary principles. It would not exist at all if matter did not exist." Quoting Timaeus, "For the generation of this universe was a mixed result of the combination of intellect and necessity." End quote. Plotinus continues, "What comes into it from God is good. The evil comes from the, quote, ancient nature, by which Plato means the underlying matter, not yet set in order by some God." The eternal emanations from the first principle, the ineffable one, run their course to their very end, and at their end is matter. The furthest edge or extremity of emanation is a stubborn substrate. But without it, the universe would be incomplete. And this substrate, this underlying matter, Plotinus insists, is evil. So much for evil's necessity. What about its opposition to the good? If matter is evil, then immaterial beings are, by virtue of being immaterial, free of evil. But material beings are caught between their recalcitrant material substrate and the intelligible forms that attempt to mold that stiff clay. The forms work, so to speak, from within beings, that is, they inform beings. But just as the forms work from within to inform, so the material substrate thwarts those efforts from within. As a result, quote, "The formative forces immanent in matter are corrupted in matter and infected with its nature." End quote. By impeding the work of the in-working forms, matter serves as a contagion and pulls material beings from higher to lower levels of being and reality. What we recognize as evil in the world is simply the result of what we might call the drag of matter. But I'm interested in a slightly different version of this opposition. In the passage I mentioned above, Plotinus says that the first principle, the good, and its last emanation, evil matter, together serve as, quote, contrary principles in the universe. The dualism is even more striking in other passages, such as when he says that, quote, "Just as there is absolute good, so there must be absolute evil." But the parallel goes further as Plotinus articulates a negative ontology of evil that mirrors the negative ontology of the ineffable one. The one, for instance, is beyond existence, but evil matter has a sort of form of non-existence. On the one hand, Plotinus wants to distinguish the non-being of the ineffable one from the non-being of evil. One is beyond, the other below being. On the other hand, his efforts to distinguish sharply between the one and the other run contrary to the case he builds for how deeply similar they are. Evil matter has a kind of unmeasuredness, ametrion, and unboundedness, apiron, and formlessness, anidhion. Furthermore, evil matter is not accidentally, but essentially unmeasured, uncontained, and formless. But of course, so is the ineffable one. It lies beyond all the measures, bounds, and forms that make up intelligible being. He says that evil is a shadow compared with intelligible being. The word he uses here that's translated as shadow is eidolon, or idol. And it means phantom or ghost, but also the image or likeness of a god, including, in Greek mythology, a god's own projection of himself as a double, or as it were, a doppelganger. In this sense, evil is the eidolon, not of being, but of the ineffable one. Another way of saying this is that the one, of necessity, brings forth its own double, evil matter. in what is to my mind the most remarkable passage from Plotinus' essay on evil, he asks, how do we know evil? How do we know matter? He's not asking how we recognize something as evil in the world or how we apprehend a material being. It's not on that level of epistemology. Instead, he's asking how we know evil qua evil, how we know matter qua matter. The question is difficult because precisely because one can only properly know beings. And since evil matter has a sort of non-existence, falls below being, so to speak, strictly speaking, we shouldn't be able to know it. But of course the same is true of the ineffable one. We cannot know it since it is not a being. And yet some of the most passionate passages in Plotinus concern precisely how we can, and must, return to the one, commune with it, unite with it. And here, in Ennead 1:8-9, Plotinus is wondering whether and how we might do the same with evil. I direct you to this long quote on the handout. First of all, he says that, quote, because it is unbounded, we know it by removal. Removal, aphoresis, or clearing away, is also a crucial practice for our return to the ineffable one. It's a sculptural term made famous by Plotinus in another passage in which he recommends that we become our own sculptors and remove or clear away the stone that hides our divine image hidden in the rough rock. That image hidden in the rough rock is the mind, or the nous, which of course must also be removed if we are to return to the one beyond being. But here Plotinus imagines us doing this same operation, aphoresis, in order to know evil. He goes on. But how do we know what has absolutely no part in form? By absolutely taking away all form, we call that in which there is no form matter. In the process of taking away all form, we apprehend formlessness in ourselves, if we propose to look at matter. So this which sees matter is another intellect which is not intellect. It presumes to see what is not its own. Although, quote, we call that in which there is no form matter, we could equally call that in which there is no form the one. Indeed, Plotinus himself does. But following him here, notice that as we pursue our knowledge of evil and remove all form, again like a sculptor, we apprehend formlessness and we apprehend it in ourselves. Like the one, evil is not an object we can encounter or a region to which we can travel, but rather a formless dimension of reality that we apprehend as always already in us, but exceeding us. And what allows us to apprehend that dimension is, quote, another intellect which is not intellect. A faculty Plotinus can only specify by means of yet another negation. The tension between affirmation and negation continues to heighten as Plotinus struggles to give voice to how we might see and so know our innermost contrary, the darkness of ineffable evil. He writes, as an eye withdraws itself from the light so that it may see the darkness and not see it, leaving the light is so that it may see the darkness, since with the light it cannot see it, but without something it cannot see it, but only not see, that it may be able to see in the way it is possible to see darkness. So, intellect, leaving its own light in itself, and as it were going outside itself, and coming to what is not its own, by not bringing its own light with it, experiences something contrary to itself, that it may see its own contrary. I won't pretend to do justice to this short passage, and in the interests of time we must soon move on to Proclass and Dionysius. But consider how heightened and fraught Plotinus's prose is here. His words and his concepts are set against themselves. Light and darkness, sight and blindness, going out and coming in. Plotinus writes like this only when he is in the most tortured of territory. and there is no more tortured territory than the approach to the ineffable one. We might be forgiven if we mistook this passage as a description of our approach to the one. After all, the passage crescendos with a description of an ecstasy, the intellect's going outside itself, so as to encounter and experience its own contrary. What is the intellect's contrary? Evil, of course. Or is it the one? Plotinus says that that to experience evil is like trying to see darkness. But let me put it to you this way. If you have been plunged into the darkness, how can you really distinguish between evil and the one? Or, how do you make a distinction within that which you are ecstatically experiencing as your ontological contrary, that which exceeds being? In the darkness, just how much weight can the prepositions beyond or below bear for distinguishing the one from evil? Let's move on to Proclass and Dionysius. For those of you unfamiliar with Proclass, a few words of introduction. He's one of the last great Neoplatonists, often surnamed Diadochos, or successor, this being the title for the head of the Platonic Academy in Athens. He was wildly prolific and, unlike Plotinus, displayed a penchant for systemization. His short treatise, De Malorum Subsistentia, or On the Existence of Evils, offers a sharp alternative to Plotinus's view of evil, and one that would prove to be much more influential. His treatise wielded unusual influence precisely because it was essentially plagiarized by a Christian author in the 6th century, Dionysius the Areopagite. Indeed, the fact that the divine names of Dionysius contains an extended and close paraphrase of Proclus's treatise on evil allowed 19th century philologists to demonstrate that the Dionysian corpus was not from the 1st century, as it presents itself, but was an elaborate work of pseudepigrapha from the late 5th or early 6th century, by a Christian who was very well versed in Proclass. Embedded in the divine names, and under the name of no less an authority than Dionysius the Areopagite, Proclus's account of evil had an influence it would not otherwise have had. Although Proclus never names him in this treatise, Plotinus is clearly his principal target. For Proclus, Plotinus has veered off course, from monism to dualism. While some admire Plotinus's subtle, sophisticated balance between a single first principle, the one, and its necessary and opposite counterpart, evil matter, Proclus regards this as simply incoherent. Since evil is the last but necessary emanation of the one, according to Plotinus, Proclus understandably insists that the one is still ultimately the cause of evil in this picture. And according to his understanding of causality, a cause is, in a greater sense, whatever its effect is. So, if the one is the cause of evil, then the one must be more evil than evil. But conversely, effects revert to their cause. That is to say, they strive to be more like their cause. So, if the one or the good is the cause of evil, then evil would revert to the good. That is, it would strive to be more and more like the good. The two horns of this dilemma are captured nicely in Proclus's trenchant critique of Plotinus. He writes, "The good, as the cause of evil, would be evil, and evil, as being produced from the good, would be good." As if that were not enough of a damning critique, Proclus also insists that evil matter cannot oppose forms as such. Evil matter cannot, in fact, stand on its own as a contrary to the good. For Proclus, anything that exists, insofar as it exists, is good. For Proclus, then, evil doesn't exist on its own, but only in or alongside other beings. He contradicts Plotinus in part by returning to the passage we discussed earlier, Theotitus 176, and calling attention to the fact that Plato specifies how evil opposes the good. When Plato says that, quote, there must always be something opposed to the good, the precise opposition is hypenantion, a sub-contrary. Evil does not oppose the good on equal footing, such that good and evil would be members of the same genus. Rather, Proclass insists, Plato is careful to say that evil opposes good, but from below, not as its equal. But where does this leave the ontology of evil? First of all, contrary to Plotinus, Proclass insists that there is no absolute evil. In fact, it's better not to speak of evil, but rather of evils, in the plural, since all that we can speak about are beings in which evil appears, in or alongside them, impeding their proper being. If we are forced to speak of evil itself, then evil should be understood as a par hypostasis, a byproduct, or, as some prefer to translate it, a parasite on beings. This bug afflicts only certain beings, what Proclass calls intermittent participants. There's no need to linger over that term, except to say that in the great emanation from the one to matter, Proclass thinks that cracks, so to speak, necessarily appear in the lower order of beings. These beings don't participate continuously in the intelligible forms, but only intermittently. They flicker, as it were, and in those breaks in their participation, the parasite of evil finds its entry. This, by the way, is how Proclass explains the necessity of evil, which again, he's forced to affirm in some way because of Theodotus 176. So while both Plotinus and Proclass affirm the necessity of evil and its opposition to the good, following the Platonic dialogue, they differ widely on how to understand that necessity and opposition. There's certainly something elegant in Proclass's solution. There doesn't seem to be a whiff of the dualism on offer in Plotinus, and evil's ontology becomes even more elusive than in Plotinus. You might think that Proclass has won the day, that he has solved the problem and sharply distinguished evil from the one. But consider the following. Yes, evil falls outside of being, below it, as par hypostasis and sub-contrary. And yet evil continues to haunt being. And in order to gesture at this ghostly ontology, Proclass is forced to use negations and metaphors, two of the principal linguistic strategies of any negative ontology of the divine. Furthermore, Proclass insists that evils cannot exist on their own, or appear as such, but only in or alongside beings. But this makes for an interesting parallel with the one, which also cannot exist because it exceeds existence, which cannot appear as itself, but only in its effects, namely beings. So it would seem that we are veiled from both evil as evil, and from the one as the one. Finally, Proclass even concedes, and this concession is striking for his modern readers, he even concedes that evil is somehow uncaused, pos anetion. Of course, for it to be caused would be to reinscribe it into the order of beings, and then Proclass would find himself in the same dilemma as Plotinus. But this is a remarkable concession precisely because within Proclass's own system, only the one is uncaused. As Plato writes in the Timaeus, quote, "Whatever is produced must be produced by a cause, for it's impossible for something to be produced without a cause." And so just as we are rescued from some of the problems inherent in Plotinus's account of evil, problems that suggested a deep and unsettling parallel between evil, matter, and the one, so with Proclass we're delivered again into this same unsettling parallel in which evil and the one emerge as both uncaused. For Proclass, the goal is to exonerate the one of responsibility for the existence of evils in the world. But in order to do so, you might say that he has to make evil, like God, uncaused. Or to put it more bluntly, the only way to save God from evil is to make evil a god. The parallel between God and evil becomes, in my mind, even more acute when Dionysius excerpts Proclus's treatise in his divine names. In Plotinus and Proclus, at least, the parallel is somewhat obscured by the fact that their accounts of evil are kept distinct and set apart from their descriptions of the ineffable one. But Dionysius puts the Proclean theory of evil squarely at the center of his meditation on the divine names. More specifically, in Book 4 on the divine names, good and beautiful. His aim, at least in part, is similar to Proclus's, namely to show that the existence of evils in the world does not contradict God's goodness and beauty. But the result is that in a single book, Dionysius will exhort his readers to seek an ecstatic encounter with the God who exceeds being, and then explain in great detail that evil too in a way exceeds being, and like God is somehow uncaused. Just as Dionysius insists that evil does not contradict the divine names good and beautiful, so he seems to borrow Proclus's negative ontology of evil, and could be said to make evil a kind of divine name, another name of God. With this unsettling suggestion, I would like to close. Why is it that these three thinkers leave us with the distinct impression that evil is very much like the ineffable one, or the God beyond being? That evil is somehow divine? Let me be clear that none of them say as much, but what they do say suggests as much. And the suggestion is frankly unsettling. Or is it? Certainly it's shocking to many believers to say that God is evil. But is it any less shocking, or indeed more, to say that evil is like God? Or is God? Or that God and evil are names, perhaps divine names, for the same thing, so to speak, namely that which exceeds being. In this case, maybe when we say God or evil, we are not naming two distinct things, both of which have some peculiar non-being, but we are rather naming two ways in which beings relate to and show forth that which exceeds being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Our second speaker is Ellie Schoenfeld. So there's a slight change from the program. Dr. Schonfeld teaches modern Jewish philosophy in the Jewish Philosophy and General Studies departments at Tel Aviv University, and is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and at the Van Leer Institute here. He got his PhD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem with a dissertation on the phenomenology of subjectivity in Husserl, Sartre, and Levinas, and his first book, The Wonder of Subjectivity, a reading of Levinas' philosophy, was published by Resling in 2007. Please.
Thank you. Allow me to start with a confession. Nothing seems to me more appropriate in the context of our conference on evil and sin than to start with a confession. What is a confession if not the link itself between evil and sin? If not to charge, to load evil with an infinite weight, if not to recognize, to decipher in the heart of evil a relation to transcendence. Kierkegaard, in his Sickness unto Death, writes, "Nor is it now and then one sins before God, for every sin is before God, or rather, it is this being before God which properly makes human guilt or evil to be a sin." End of quotation. To confess out loud or in the intimacy of one's heart means to recognize the relation between evil, something wrong I might have done or something wrong that might have happened to me, and sin. Better, it means to create this relation between evil and sin. It is to point out at the origin of sin, at the origin of evil, a sin, and thus to create an ethical, theological causality between evil and sin. To confess, in other words, is to rename or to rebaptize evil. By the act of confession, evil becomes sin before God, in the words of Kierkegaard. This relation between evil and sin is not self-evident. This because, as such as it appears to us in the world, evil is orphan, it has no father. Nietzsche, in one of his aphorisms on religion, recognizes precisely in the relation religions draw between evil and sin the major phantasm of religion, responsible for its wandering and its fallacy, responsible for religion's evil. Aphorism 78 in Daybreak, Book 1, is entitled Justice Which Punishes, die strafende Gerechtigkeit, and deals exactly with our question. I'll quote in length this passage from Nietzsche. Misfortune, Unglück, and guilt, Schuld. Christianity has placed these two things on a balance, so that when misfortune consequent on guilt is great, even now the greatness of the guilt itself is still involuntarily measured by it. But this is not antique, and this is why the Greek tragedy, which speaks so much, yet in so different a sense of misfortune and guilt, is a great liberator of the spirit, in a way in which the ancients themselves could not feel it. They were still so innocent as not to have established an adequate relationship between guilt and misfortune, or between evil and sin. Moreover, in antiquity, there still existed actual misfortune, pure, innocent misfortune. Only in Christendom did everything become punishment, well-deserved punishment. End of quotation. In tragedy, with the idea of Moira of fate, evil has no father, pure, innocent evil, cathartic evil. The religious invention or the invention of the religious, according to this aphorism, it's one between lots of others aphorisms in Nietzsche's work, in Nietzsche's critique of religion, consists precisely in the introduction of the idea of sin in the world, in formulating an adequate relationship between guilt and misfortune, an idea which contaminates the purity of our living in the world as fatal, tragic heroes. I leave Nietzsche alone for a moment. He'll return when he'll feel it. I recapitulate. Confession means first and foremost confessing the mere relation of evil to sin. In the bottom of every concrete confession lies this first confession, which consists in confessing the relation itself between evil and sin. In confession, one does in fact two things. One, he confesses for some evil he might have done, and simultaneously, two, he confesses the very relation between evil and sin. And by this act, he brings into being a world in which this relation exists. In other words, an archi-confession lies in every confession, conditioning the very act of confession or confessing. From this we can deduce or suspect that confession is not given to anyone, or that it is not given to anyone to confess. I turn now to my actual confession, because I have a confession to make. That's how philosophers work. They first have to explain what it is. I have to confess that I know nothing about this relation I just talked about between evil and sin. In my existence, I am incapable to draw a relation between evil and sin. At least I am incapable to draw this relation religion draws, and which Nietzsche, for instance, criticizes. It is impossible for me to hear naively the teaching of Rav Ami, perhaps in Tractat Shabbat 15.5a, There is no death without transgression, and there is no suffering without sin. Ein mita belo chet ve'ein isurin belo avon. The confession I wish to place at the head of my talk, a confession which is already an action, a speech act, perhaps an evil speech act, which itself is worth of some repentance or of some confession, has to do with this archi-confession I have just described. It has to do with that which allows confession in the religious regime, or better, to this gnosis of confession that makes religion exist. This gnosis, this knowledge, again, I have to confess I do not possess. I admit the paradoxical nature of my confession, like an atheist or perhaps an agnostic that would go and confess his atheism to a priest, or better, who would go and confess his atheism before God. But perhaps this paradoxical situation is what characterizes more than anything our present times. At least, it opens up a singular questioning of those questions, which have to do with religion, subjectivity, evil and sin, of course, and ultimately to the possibility of still ascribing some sense to transcendence, to God. Is confession possible in those conditions? Can there be another relation between evil and sin than this ethico-metaphysical relation religion assumes to exist? Can there be another before God than the one which supposes a theological causality or a metaphysical culpability? Those are the questions I wish to address in the minutes to come. It is, of course, the disproportion between evil, this overwhelming visibility of evil, so objective, so palpable, so banal, and sin, so invisible, so shifty, so evasive, so subjective, that does not allow us to accept the doctrine of the relation of sin and evil. Auschwitz, if one had to name the event, is the proper name that this disproportion takes for us today in our minds. Lacking the possibility to proportionate the event, to recreate a right equilibrium, it is impossible to justify God. It is impossible to think evil as a consequence of sin before God. Yet the event, while manifesting the unequivocal disproportion between evil and some kind of sin or sins, is also an invitation to look closer into the idea of theodicy, into this rationalistic idea of the justification of God in a world where evil exists and perhaps prevails. It permits us to re-evaluate theodicy, to affine our criticism of this kind of reasoning. Descartes, in the first metaphysical meditation, was, to my knowledge, the first rationalist to propose a theodicic answer to the question of evil. Yet, it is of course to Leibniz that we owe this concept, which appears in the title of his 1710 dissertations, Essays on the Justice of God and the Freedom of Man in the Origin of Evil. In French, it was written in French, Essai de Théodicée sur la bonté de Dieu, la liberté de l'homme et l'origine du mal. You remember Leibniz's doctrine. Our actual world is the best possible world. The pre-established harmony, the principle of sufficient reason, God's goodness, His almightiness, all those assures us that among the infinite possible worlds God could have created, God created the best one. How should we then explain the existence of evil in this world? God, who is benevolent, created. Leibniz says evil is a relative evil. It is a necessary evil. It is relative because it has to be compared to other possible worlds. It is necessary because seen from above, in the general sun of things and in comparison with other possible worlds, evil is, in fact, necessary for the shaping of the best, perfect, better world we live in. Our perspective being limited, we cannot see this. We are only impressed by the visibility of evil. In his Theodicy, Book 1, paragraph 9, Leibniz writes, I'll quote just a little passage of this very long, actually the whole book is about this. Thus, writes Leibniz, if the smallest evil that comes to pass in the world were missing in it, it would no longer be this world, which, with nothing omitted and all allowance made, was found the best by the Creator who chose it. In the 18th century, Voltaire, in his Candide l'Optimiste, already made a parody out of Leibniz's theory. How, after the Lisbon earthquake, for instance, can one still hold such a doctrine? How can one justify the death, the sufferings of one innocent child? All those themes are well known. Yet it is important to remember them in order to look closer into them. What is unbearable in Leibniz's reasoning? What is unbearable in the Theodiceic reasoning in general? It is not the sharp disproportion between evil and some eventual sin one may attribute to it, or the presence of evil that strike immediately the eye or the heart. What is inaudible, what is etymologically absurd, is the mere idea of calculation. And Leibniz is a big mathematician. Son of the scientific revolution, he admits, he supposes, that it is possible to quantify matter. The world is ciphered. It is the task of the scientific, of the philosopher, to decipher, to decrypt this ciphered world, to procure us the formulas that translates matter into quantity. It is here exactly at this point that this thinking encounters a huge obstacle, a massive stumbling block. Evil, suffering, is not quantifiable. If one detaches evil from its subjective root, one deforms the phenomena itself. To adopt a contemplative attitude, a theoretical attitude with evil, means actually avoiding looking at the phenomenon. It means avoiding to be in relation with suffering, be it my suffering or the suffering of the other. Calculative reason collapses whenever facing evil. It cannot answer it, not because it lacks good, reasonable answers, but because it does not meet the legitimate claims of the suffering subject, of the concrete phenomena of evil. Evil, in this sense, is really invisible to calculating reason. This is why, perhaps often and very coherently, even is considered to be an illusion for those rationalistic thinkers, a phantasm, a res imaginationis. I think of Spinoza in his appendix to the first book of the Ethics. From the point of view of reason, the category of evil does not apply to being. In order to surpass the theoretical point of view, we have to place ourselves on the sphere of the lived experience, on the sphere of Erlebnis. We ought to hear what is at stake in the realm of existence as to the question of evil. We have to be attentive to what one could call the dramatic of existence. The starting point is not the question of the justification of God, which is a trouble for theologians, but the question of the scandal of evil. The scandal of evil before and beyond every theological consideration. The scandal of evil as it is lived by a suffering subject. This is henceforth our primordial phenomena, the milieu from within which we have to elaborate our thinking, from within which we have to form our concepts. We have to think in a close proximity to suffering. We have to think close to the nagging toothache or the acute headache. We have to be attentive to what, from within the experience of pain, happens in the realm of existence. It is not impossible to overcome this scandal, to anesthesiate it. And this is perhaps what philosophy does, a certain philosophy at least. But, and this is the important point, it always does it in retrospect, after the fact, too late. We have to try to maintain ourselves on the level of the fact, of the phenomenon. Not, in French we say après coup, to say, after the fact is après coup. We have to stay on the level of the coup, which is also to hit someone, to get, how do you say? A blow, a kick. We have to feel the kick, not reason après coup. The kick of suffering. I guess this was also what revolted Nietzsche. He couldn't bear the retrospective gaze, the distance that a theodiceic theology assumes vis-à-vis suffering. Contrarily to the religious or theological relation to evil, tragedy, which Nietzsche brings forth, looks evil straight into the eye. It is a way of staying close to suffering, not to stand aside. It expresses a genuine experience of suffering, pure, innocent misfortune, as we saw earlier. Our question now can be formulated more precisely. Is it possible, without stepping away from evil, from the very proximity to the concrete phenomena of suffering, to talk meaningfully about God? Can the scandalous experience of suffering still suffer some reference to transcendence? I wish to depict here very briefly a phenomenology of suffering. This phenomenology is directly inspired from Emmanuel Levinas, who from his earliest texts deals with the question of evil and suffering. In Time and the Other, text from 1947, Levinas describes suffering as a contraction of the self, as the place where one experiences solitude, loneliness, at its extreme. By suffering, man isolates himself from the world surrounding him. He is locked up in himself, without any possible escape, writes Levinas. Physical suffering, in all its degrees, entails the impossibility of detaching oneself from the instant of existence. It is the very irremissibility of being. The content of suffering merges with the impossibility of detaching oneself from suffering. In suffering, there is an absence of all refuge. It is the fact of being directly exposed to being. End of quotation. In suffering, I am isolated from the others and exposed to being. I am isolated in being exposed. As an exorbitant nudity, in me being exposed, in me being an open wound, the bond between me and the others, between me and those decently clothed men, between me and civilization, is broken. Suffering is thus suffering is first and foremost this exposition, this nudity, this vulnerability which closes us up in a tragic loneliness. Levinas adds to this description: suffering is an experience of pure passivity. In suffering, man does not live as activity, transcendental ego synthesizing his impressions and his perceptions, but as passivity. It is the impossibility of operating any synthesis, the impossibility of establishing any order in our world. I quote, "The subject seems to reach the limit of the possible in suffering. It finds itself enchained, overwhelmed, and in some way passive. Yet this passivity, this suffering, is not silent. It is, properly speaking. To be attentive to this speech of suffering is in a way to get close or closer to the phenomena of suffering and perhaps of evil. What distinguishes suffering from simple pain is the excess, the too much, the unbearability to which I assist, or better, which is the I at the moment of suffering. To live as in excess, to experience this unbearability, so much as to desire to die, this is suffering. In a text from 1982 entitled Useless Suffering, Levinas writes, "Suffering is, I quote, an excess, an unwelcome superfluity that is inscribed in a sensorial content." End of quotation. This is the place where from within the vacancy of sense emerges a new kind of expression. I quote, "The denial, the refusal of meaning, trusting itself forward as a sensible quality, that is, in the guise of experienced content, the way in which, within a consciousness, the unbearable is precisely not born, the manner of this not being born from to bear, which in itself is a sensation or a datum. In this sense, Levinas writes, suffering is the locus in which passivity signifies originally." End of quotation. What is this original expression? What is signified in suffering? What is, properly speaking, said? Before everything, this passivity, this excess, this impossibility to bear means an original no. The original refusal, the original negation is the negation emanating from suffering. What counts, writes Levinas, in the non-freedom or the submission of suffering is the concreteness of a not, looming as an evil more negative than any apophantic not. The not of evil is a negativity extending as far as to the realm of unmeaning. End of quotation. One can imagine the capricious no of a child, which stands there defying all the rules of logic. Or perhaps it is the man who, through pure suffering, returns to childhood, who cries. Levinas writes about this, where suffering attains its purity, supreme responsibility turns into supreme irresponsibility, into infancy. Sobbing is this, the infantile shaking of sobbing. Sobbing is the mute expression of pure suffering. The body is the locus of expression here. The body is overflowed. It overflows. The tear is already a complaint. More than the original pre-apophantic no that we have recognized as participating to the form of suffering. The tear, the weeping, is the locus where the excess is translated into a complaint, where suffering becomes visible and audible. The shout of pain is an original language, a primordial expression of the soul. It is an unveiling of the soul from within the expression of complaint, which is addressed to God knows who. Why do you make me suffer and not reserve for me rather an eternal happiness? This is a first saying, a first question or first lamentation or first prayer, writes Levinas. And he concludes, in any case, this is the summons of a you and a glimpse of the good behind evil. End of quotation. Luzzatto, the 18th century Italian Jewish philosopher and Kabbalist, begins his major book on morals, Mesilat Yesharim, the path of the just, by explaining just this. Man was not created to suffer. This is the scandal of evil. The revolt against evil is the genuine expression of this scandalon. We understand now better that this primordial no, the primordial revolt, which is a question turning into a solicitation, or a refusal which becomes a prayer, cannot be inscribed in the mathematical structure problem solution. To the pre-apophantic no, we cannot answer with a simple logical deductive and apophantic yes. Such is, nevertheless, the character of the Theodiceic answers. In order to meet the legitimate expectations of suffering, in order to approach the genuine protestation of the suffering subjects, we have to turn to another region. This other region is the region of consolation. 10 minutes? Oh, it's enough. Okay, this is the last part of my talk. The idea of consolation is, for me, and at this particular moment, a liminal idea. If this notion was to make sense, it will be only to the extent that we would be able to formulate a description of consolation that meets the requirements I just have drawn. Consolation has to address the profound claims of suffering. It has to address the legitimate accusations of the weeping man. What is consolation? What is that which consoles? And is consolation still possible? Those questions, in the mere effort of posing them, are displacing or elevating, I hope, the debate from the theoretical-theological questions of justification of God, etc., to an existential level, to a level which meets more intimately the requirements of suffering. By mere posing the question of evil from this point of view, a new horizon opens. What is consolation? I am compelled here to reiterate my first confession and apply it to consolation. I have no knowledge of consolation. The most I can say is I know what consolation cannot be. It cannot be distraction. Theodicy, when it aims at consoling, what it often does, is doing this through distraction, through a brutal occultation of the source of suffering. This consolation cannot be. What it is positively, again, I do not know. I would not be surprised if there was a relation between the ignorance concerning the relation between evil and sin and the ignorance concerning the true nature of consolation, of the consoling logos. That is all I can say. But this ignorance is important. Sometimes ignorance is the only true starting point for a genuine reflection. Remember Socrates. The challenge is to stay close to this point of ignorance. Therefore, I wish to end this study with some references, some texts which are about consolation, and which I hope, I believe, will help me one day to get closer to a better hearing of the sense of consolation. Those references, which I will evoke now very briefly, more briefly I thought, without too much commentary, are not meant to give an encyclopedic overview of the notion of consolation. They were chosen on a very subjective basis, and I could easily imagine other texts participating to this inventory. Perhaps everyone should or could compose such a repertoire. So I have a few minutes. Okay, so I will really just freely improvise on those steps. It's a method that I borrow from Roland Barthes when he's doing semiology of ideas. So he has this way of just repertoriating textual locuses. And so those are my textual locuses concerning the notion of consolation. The first point I would have elaborated a little bit more on would have been the notion of consolation in Hebrew. In the original Hebrew, in the sacred language, as Rosenzweig and others name it, is of course nechama. In the Book of Lamentations, we meet those notions. Because the comforter or the consoler that should relieve my soul is far from me, none to comfort her, en menachemla, etc., etc. In Isaiah we have a lot of prophecies of consolation which use the term of nechama. What is important to stress, and this is the first point, is that nechama, from the root nacham, nun chet mem, has yet another sense, signification, which is actually more original, at least in Genesis. It is used in a quite other way, which means actually to confess or to regret. Ki nacham Hashem al ki bara et ha'adam, ki nichamti ki asitem, ki nachem Hashem ki asa et ha'adam ba'aretz. When God looks at man and he sees they are doing wrong things, then he says, well, I repent of doing them. Then he uses this term, nacham, nachem, which is actually the root from which is drawn the root nechama. There would be some nice thing to say about Noach, the Noach, the forefather, whose name is also related to Nechama, the same root, and it is also related to this kind of situation in which God decides to destroy the world, to destroy humanity, and then he chooses a man he calls Noach, who relate also in his name to this idea of Nechama, of Nacham, of Nachem, of this turning point. The second reference I would have evoked more in length is a philosophical reference from the Fido of Plato. So remember, the Fido of Plato deals with the eternity of the soul. Cebes and Simmias are dialoguing with Socrates, and there is a very interesting passage before actually the 3 or 4, depending on how we read this dialogue. Before Socrates, Plato is getting into actually demonstrating or proving the eternity of the soul. He is responding to Simmias, who says, well, perhaps the soul after death would be dispersed like breath and smoke and would no longer be anywhere. And then he said, well, in order to avoid this conclusion, which is a very bad conclusion, the soul being nothing, well, we would need, and here is the important part, we would have need a consoling speech, consoling language. In Greek, paramousia, I don't know if I pronounce it well, I guess no, paramousia, a consoling speech. Again, it would be interesting to elaborate on this. All the proofs of the eternity of the soul in the Fido are to be read in the context of a consoling speech. So it's a kind of paradoxical logos. It's a logos which brings together this idea of proving mathematically or deductively some very important theme, the eternity of the soul. But when Plato wants to explain what is the true nature of this logos, well, then he actually speaks about this paramousia, about a consoling speech. Okay, I have to finish. So really, I just give headlines without evaluating. Huh? Une phrase? No. Okay, I'm sorry. I will 3 phrases. Christophe will allow it. Special intervention of. Okay, so I would elaborate on prophecies of consolation and the idea of a kind of knowledge of consolation we have from the texts. The end of the book of Job is also about consolation. That's the 4th reference. The 5th reference is about those Consolatio Philosophia, a whole range of philosophical texts from Stoic inspiration, which are dealing with this. Okay, I see there is a kind of rush here. I will end with the Messiah, which name is, according to a place in the Yerushalmi, Menachem, or the Consoler. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie. So our third speaker is very Reverend John Pantalemon Manusakis, who is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the College of the Holy Cross and an Honorary Fellow at the Australian Catholic University. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Boston College under the directorship of Richard Kearney and Jean-Luc Marion. He has authored 2 books, 20 articles and chapters in volumes, and edited 5 volumes.
Thank you very much. I would like to apologize to all of you, and in particular to my 2 co-presenters. One will think that wearing the priestly cassock and the cross and the hat, you will become like a Superman and of sorts, and invulnerable to any kind of human frailty. But it only takes jet lag and to remind you that you're only a human. So I have been feeling a little bit sick as the panel began, so I was able only to hear parts of your excellent papers that I would have liked to devote my full attention to them. And I would like to thank Professor Gabriel Motzkin, not only for being the host of this event, but for being at hand also to read my paper in case that I was not able, and I think it would be good to stay nearby in case that something happens. You can step in as the Deus Ex Machina. I would also like to thank Professor Smith and Dr. Merav Mak for the invitation and the organization of this event. I thought that it was important for me to read the paper myself, even under the present circumstances, as the least that I can do to the kindness of all the people who invited me here and of all of you who came here. So, the sin of being. To think of sin, one must think of beginnings, of becoming, since every beginning is a becoming, and every becoming must have a beginning, and conversely of what cannot begin, for it already and always has been, that is, has been, or rather is being. Sin, then, is in some sense of being. By that I mean to express the inevitable connection of the category of sin with the threefold of nature, time, and freedom. That connection must, of course, be traced back to its beginnings, which, as we all know, begin at the beginning and with the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim. What does it mean to have a beginning, to have begun, to be in the between? We will return to these questions and to the texts in which they have their origin. Before we do so, however, allow me to indulge in a brief etymological excursion that the term sin suggests. Linguistically, then, sin is closer associated with ontology than with morality. If we trace the origin of the word guilty back to the Latin adjective sons, genitive sondis, with probable derivation from the verb esse, to be. On the other hand, think for a moment along the path of the Greek language, then we are presented with a vocabulary familiar from the Greek tragedy that includes such terms as hubris and amartia, even though there is a term, I will suggest, much closer at our philosophical home, namely that of atia, a term whose translation into the Latin as causa and thereby into cause, Heidegger rightly protests as misleading. It would be closer to its Greek meaning if we were to think of atia as, for example, in aitiatiki, that is, in the accusative case, Heidegger writes, das was ein anderes verschuldet. When the philosopher speaks of causes and causality, he stands at the tribunal of reason as the accuser. To call the cause of a becoming, since only that which becomes is in need of a be cause, is to accuse, to proclaim that which comes to be as guilty. Nothing is more familiar to philosophy and to philosophers than accusations. The first and therefore the oldest of them is the accusation of being, in the double sense of having been or of having come to be. Recall the mu fine of the tragic hero. Oedipus says, I wish I was not born, mu fine. And of that accusation that only being itself, can pronounce. Perhaps it was Anaximander who first adopted the language of crime and punishment in philosophy, as a surviving fragment of his thought seems to suggest. According to this fragment, Anaximander must have seen the world as an immense crime scene where the crime of being is continuously committed. Things are coming to being, and that means that a moment ago they were not. Being is not theirs, for it can be taken away from them as it did at will, paying penance and being judged for their injustices in accordance with the ordinance of time. In an unpublished work in his lifetime, a youthful Nietzsche imagines Anaximander addressing beings thus: "Why are you here? Your guilt, I see, causes you to tarry in your existence. With your death, you have to expiate it." The first accusation, then, that philosophy investigates is that of being itself, of a certain unlawfulness in our origin, and in front of such accusation we stand all equally guilty, an original guilt. So much with atia, then. However, one cannot think of atia without conjuring up its twin concept, namely archi. In Aristotle's Metaphysics, the two terms occur almost always together. Wisdom, for example, is the knowledge of ton proton, archon και αιτιών. So once more the question of beginning presents itself, whether through the opening word of Genesis, whose other name is the beginning, or through Aristotle's first beginnings, protearche, a word that, thanks to its Latin translation as principium, has come to mean not only the beginning, but also the principle. What does it mean then to have a beginning, an archi, to find oneself already under the principle of the principium, of the beginning? The answer now offers itself. Having a beginning means, above all, that one is not anarchic, that one recognizes oneself at the very least as a derivative, secondary being, a being whose very being, precisely because it had a beginning, cannot therefore mistake itself as its own beginning, that is, as autarchic. It is the impossibility of such an autarchic being that becomes thematized in the book that so erroneously has been taken to be an autobiography, namely St. Augustine's Confessions. That impossibility is before anything else demonstrated performatively. Thus, in the first book, we are met with the difficulty of beginning, especially of beginning at the beginning, as an autobiography ought, since we are beings that have already begun. We found ourselves already in media res, meta-beings, in the twofold sense that the meta has for William Desmond's work. After, but also in the midst. On the other hand, an autobiography that begins is a contradiction in terms, for the only being that can lay claim to autobiography, in the strict sense, is precisely a being without a beginning. Yet the Confessions begin, and appropriately so, not sub propria voce sui, but through the voice of another, that of the psalmist. Book 1 speaks of the origins of man, not only of this man who recalls his childhood in Thag-Geist, but of man in general, of mankind as such, and therefore of the origins of sin. Already in the opening lines, the theme of death and sin, and of their connection that is traced back to the primordial garden, which St. Augustine's narrative so skillfully reenacts in the Garden of the Stolen Fruit, that is, the theme of death as the result of sin, is announced at the very first sentence of the Confessions. Homo circumferens mortalitatem suam, circumferens testimonium peccati sui, and testimonium qui superbis resistis. Pride, namely the refusal to recognize one's origin, or better yet, the refusal to recognize that one has an origin, becomes the beginning of sin. So here sin begins with the denial of the beginning. Thus, the wisdom of Sirach affirms that pride is the beginning of all sin. Let it be noted that pride is incidentally autobiography's motivating thrust, which, it should be now made clear, far from being synonymous with the Confessions, it is very opposite. A confession is in the threefold sense of its meaning, that is, confessions of sins, profession of faith, and praise. All three, by the way, intrinsically connected, as each one constitutes a logical progression in the spiritual life, is nothing but the acknowledgement that everything one has and is, except sin, is given from God. The condition that excludes sin leads to the paradoxical conclusion that the only thing which probably belongs to me, and furthermore the thing that by a sinister principium individuationis defines me, is my sin. The only thing, therefore, that one could legitimately be proud of is sin itself. But since sin is nothing more, as we have seen, than pride, the only thing that one could be proud of is one's own pride, in the very sense that a will wills its own willing. Here sin is revealed as an empty structure that seeks self-affirmation by running amok, that is, by pointing back at its emptiness. It is in this sense that one can say that the origin of sin is sin, and that sin begets sin, which is to say, in agreement with the scholastic tradition, that sin does not have a proper cause. We heard a little bit about that, evil in Charles' talk earlier, but it's only a presuppositionless negation. At the same time, one becomes aware of the irony in the autobiographical effort, for the self-narrated self has nothing to say, no matter how verbose it may otherwise be. This denial of the origin, the forgetfulness of the beginning, can also be expressed differently as the denial of mediation and intermediation. Under this concept, sin is the desire for immediacy in two senses. First, in time, as that which, unable to suffer the passing of time, becomes averse to time itself and to history. And secondly, as that which, unable to wait for the other, seeks to bring about what is to take place on its own and by itself, becoming averse to any form of dependency on the other. Kafka must have had this in mind when he wrote, "There are two main human sins from which all the others derive, impatience and indolence. It was because of impatience that they were expelled from paradise. It is because of indolence that they do not return. Yet perhaps there is only one major sin, impatience. Because of impatience they were expelled. Because of impatience they do not return." The first man sinned insofar as he wanted to achieve, without waiting, what was promised to him anyway, but in time. When the serpent promises our ancestors that eating of the forbidden fruit will make them like God, as we heard earlier in Professor Desmond's talk, he promises them in fact what has already been planned by God as humanity's destiny, its theosis. I hope I don't agree with Hegel by saying that. The object of sin here is neither different nor contrary to God's will. Rather, sin consists entirely not on what one desires, but how does one desire, that is, on this double immediacy. What our ancestors heard in the voice of the serpent was the seduction of the here and now. It is in this sense that sin can have its beginning only at the very beginning, at the very inception of time, when one cannot measure time, or by faking such timelessness. Thus, it's necessary not to avoid the controversial position that affirms the existence of sin already at the beginning of history, dispelling any notions of primordial perfection. Even though one can argue that there was no moment in history that man enjoyed a sinless state of perfection, history does not begin with sin, or even less because of it, as Kierkegaard, for example, seems to think. For him, without sin there is no sexuality, and without sexuality, no history. I believe that Kierkegaard thinks of sexuality, in particular of sexual difference, as the result of sin only with respect to man, for whom, on account of his corporeal nature, sin could be thought of as having such an effect. Otherwise, he will have to explain why sin did not result in sexual differentiation when angels sinned. Yet he is right in asserting that an angel has no history. Even if Michael had made a record of all the errands he had been sent on and performed, he writes, this is nevertheless not his history. Still, to make history the aftermath of sin, or worse, the means of its punishment and correction, creates some inescapable perplexities. Instead, history, which was never for the Creator an afterthought, even if man had not sinned, is God's means of a perfection yet to be achieved, the means by which such a perfection can be reached, as we expect, eschatologically. In fact, I would like to suggest, taking my prompt from St. Augustine's Confession, that time as a movement towards perfection is at the same time the means of sin's undoing. For sooner or later, that is in time, the posse peccare has to crumble under the confession of the non posse non peccare. Admit, that is, that its capability is nothing more than its incapacity to transcend itself. Its freedom is only a condemnation to repeating itself. In time, that is in that very repetition, the sinner recognizes himself as such and despairs over his sin. But his desperation at this point is already the birth pangs of his salvation, For a sin recognized as sin constitutes already a moment after sin, a sin already delivered at the hands of time, and the hands of time, following St. Irenaeus of Lyon, are nothing else than the hands of God. It is therefore a characteristic of sin as such to be devoid of continuity. By this I don't mean to deny the habitual nature of sin, of which we're all aware, but only to call attention to its mode of existence, which is no other than that spasmodic repetition which Kierkegaard has called the sudden. Like a tic, sin repeats itself almost compulsorily, although its compulsion is but an illusion, facilitated precisely by its lack of continuity, and can be exposed as such through the lens of mediation. As a series of spasms do not make a gesture, let alone a movement, so the repetition of sin over a given amount of time fails to make up the content it lacks. It fails to arrive somewhere, for in a strange way, sin does not move, it only jumps. Thus, sooner or later, that is in time and over time, sin, no matter how enticing its promises and phantasmagoric its fantasies, must yield to boredom. In boredom, however, sin has left the timelessness of the sudden and has already become subjected to the mediation of the temporal. In other words, it can now look at itself and become aware of its emptiness. That is, sin becomes perceptible as sinful. There is therefore no need to emphasize at this point that boredom, as well as anxiety, are categories available to us only after sin, and therefore Origen's explanation of the creation of the world, a creation which for Origen is still understood in terms of a catastrophe, in its literal sense of a turning downwards, by appealing to the boredom that the souls had experienced in their eternal pre-existence, suffers from the grave mistake of conceiving boredom before the beginning, indeed as the reason for which creation began. The mistake is quite obvious. In a timeless state of existence, boredom makes little or nothing or no sense. It follows that that which makes sin perceptible as sinful, to the sinner himself above all, and thus opens the way for repentance, is mediation as, firstly, the reflection that can be afforded only by distance in time, diachronicity, and secondly, as intermediation through the relation with the other against whom I have sinned. Having said enough about the former, I now turn to the latter. Sin cannot be conceived in abstracto, that is, outside and without the relation between the sinner and the other to whom the sinner is accountable. That other, on the other hand, cannot be the sinner himself, as if that to which the sinner is accountable could be his own sense of duty, the master who lies in us, à la Kant, or his conscience. Such a misinterpretation will have returned us to the beginning of this paper, and the beginning of sin indicated, as we have already seen, by such notions as that of afterkey and autonomy. Furthermore, there is no such a thing as a consciousness in the strictest phenomenological sense, which could stand alone without being in reference to and in relation with the other. The inescapability of the other is undeniable, William Desmond writes. No, first and foremost, sin presupposes the very relation it is understood to have damaged. It presupposes the dialogue that sin has interrupted. The essential background of sin, therefore, without which the concept of sin would have been cancelled out, is what Paul Ricoeur has called the fundamental situation of a man who finds himself implicated in the initiative taken by someone who, on his side, is essentially turned towards man, namely, a God who is anthropotropic before being anthropomorphic. That is why, for Ricoeur, sin is a religious dimension before being ethical. It is not the transgression of an abstract rule, of a value, but the violation of a personal bond. A phenomenological description of sin, therefore, cannot but begin by focusing on the structure of being before God, a being in relation, or to just use one word, of being a person, a prosopon. I have analyzed elsewhere the phenomenology of prosopon, and so there is no need to return to that analysis here. It will be sufficient to ask, if sin is primarily the rupture of a relation, then how can we best envision the character of such relation? Nietzsche, in his Genealogy of Morals, puts forward a very creative interpretation of guilt, Schuld, that traces its origins back to death, Schuld. The German language facilitates the connection. The most fundamental of death is, according to him, that which is owed to one's ancestors. It is, in other words, an ancestral debt, being indebted for one's origin, an indebtedness that requires from the members of the tribe a repayment in the forms of sacrifices, feasts, music, honors, above all obedience. Nietzsche's analysis concludes with the hypothesis that the first gods, the very concept of divinity, emerge out of such contractual relationship with one's own ancestors, invested now for the first time with divine attributes on account of one's fear for them. History keeps adding to the original ancestral debt interest to such an extent that it reaches a symbolic proportion that is beyond repayment. Eventually, only a God will be able to pay back what is owed to God, a God that will become man in order to sacrifice himself in satisfaction of humanity's debt, the doctrine of atonement. That's the stroke of genius on the part of Christianity, as Nietzsche says. Continuing, God himself sacrifices himself for the guilt of mankind, God himself makes payment to himself, God as the only being who can redeem man from what became unredeemable for man himself. The creditor sacrifices himself for his debtor. Out of love, can one credit that? Out of love for his debtor. Of course, perhaps Nietzsche is being sarcastic here, but he has a point. Taking a step that anticipates Freud, Nietzsche argues that at some time in history, the relationship between two individuals, namely creditor and debtor, was internalized within a single individual. Of course, as long as that contractual relationship was external and intersubjective, did not constitute guilt as such. It became that when indebtedness and correspondingly the feeling of being indebted to, that is the feeling of an unsettled account, of unfinished business, was transferred within oneself, becoming thus intrasubjective. It is precisely this very line of thought, and here you can see the genealogy of affinities, that Heidegger picks up in the famous analysis of sections 57 and 58 from Being and Time, where the silent call of consciousness, which is consciousness itself, conscience, yes, thank you, pronounces only one verdict and always the same, guilt. What was the yes about? Conscience, yeah. Heidegger's idea of life as a series of repayments on a loan that you not agree to with ever-increasing interest that will cost you your life, that is life as a mortgage, takes us back to Anaximander's fragment. Yet in the time between Anaximander and Heidegger, a decisive transformation took place to which philosophy ought to pay attention. I speak of the almost imperceptible change from the neutral the one to the masculine toen to the masculine one, oenas, that is, of the movement from impersonal being to a personal God. In Greek, the difference is only in the definitive article, and in English it's entirely inaudible, but it's a difference big enough to make all the difference in our discussion. For being in relation with a personal God, being must also be understood as personal, and between persons the primary relation goes under the name of either eros or agape. It is telling that in the prophetic utterance, sin takes the form of an accusation for adultery, Hosea, for example. It is in turning away from God to other self-made gods and offering to them what one ought to offer only to God, not only were proven unfaithful, but also we have shown ourselves guilty of a certain religious promiscuity. Thus, the other side of adultery is sensibly enough idolatry, the other side of the coin. In the prophetic language, adultery becomes the most eloquent metaphor for idolatry, yet idolatry itself can in turn become a metaphor for sin in general. After all, as we have seen, sin is nothing else than the positing of the self as its own self-made idol. Thus, the great canon, which is sung in the Orthodox Church during the last week of Lent, puts such an anguished confession in the mouth of the faithful with great clarity. Αυτίδωλον εγενόμην. I have become an idol to myself. Self-idolization becomes therefore the final accomplishment on a course that began with the denial of beginning, only in order to end in self-denial of one's end. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the 3 excellent papers. So now we have time for questions. I open the floor. Please.
I really like the parallel you drew between the your difficulty to handle the idea of a confession which is tying evil to sin, and your difficulty with consolation, which I guess they are both tied to the subjective nature and to the incalculability. Yeah, of suffering, evil, and pain. But what surprised me that when you started talking about consolation, you didn't talk about the difficulty. You talked about the difficulty of having consolation, or a concept of consolation, not so much with the difficulty that I expected you to discuss in this parallel, which is the giving of consolation. So I was just wondering if you were getting there.
Well, I have no knowledge not of what it means of being consoled and to console, but those are two. I agree with you. Those are two aspects which are just two sides of the same coin, I would say. But what I find there is a great difficulty in consoling. It's one of the intuitions which have made me come also to this subject. I don't know if you go to a house where someone deceived, then in my personal experience, I find it, and I think I'm not alone here, find one of the most difficult things to do. I'm very embarrassed, and when I see other people do it, I feel it's not right. So there is something wrong here, and in the same time, it's one of the most important moments in life. So of course there is this question of how do you console, and I guess this is so I agree with your question. I didn't dealt with it because I actually didn't dealt with consolation at all. I just said my perplexities, and if I would have given more time, then maybe I would have said something about. No, it's not your fault. I didn't prepare it, so it's not. But that's the first step towards another chapter in which these things would have to be discussed.
What do you think about the problem as symmetrical?
It's not exactly symmetrical, because, and that's the second point, I think there is something, and that's what permits, I think, us to try or to hope to be able to speak one day positively about consolation, is that we both don't know how to console, but I think we all have some experiences of consolation. So on a subjective basis, and that would be the task of an actual phenomenology of consolation, to describe those authentic moments of consolation. And I think they are not to be found in the Theodiceic or kind of religious, in the very classical or banal sense of the term, explanations. They are to be found in other places. So it's not strictly parallel, because we have a kind of intuitive knowledge of consolation, and if we would be able to describe it a little bit, perhaps we could give some answers about the second question, which is how do you console?
Please, William. No. The microphone, please. No.
It's
Yes.
okay, it's on now. Well, I think that 3 papers are really terrific. I enjoyed all 3 of them. There's a kind of a slight disjunction between these 2 and your paper, but I think one of the things that struck me about both of your papers was, well, let's put it this way, the difference between a Greek sense of the one originating and the sense of the one originating within the space of creation. And thinking of, again, the notion of creation ex nihilo, which wasn't mentioned at all, but it could be interpreted as a giving rise to something other than the divine that opens up a different space of otherness than in, let's say, the Plotinian way of thinking, or indeed in Proclass also, where you always run the risk of a one totality enclosing all within itself. So hence that space of difference becomes differently qualified and stressed if one can try to make sense of something like the notion of creation. That was an observation, because I think it's very relevant to the issue of evil, because precisely that ambiguous space between the creator and the creature, it opens up a possibility that doesn't then necessarily have to lead to the charge that the creator is some necessitated one or all-determining principle, who then, the notion of a turn against the one, or various movements that I tried to talk a little bit about today. But I wonder if you would comment on that a little bit. But in terms of Ellie's paper, there's some marvelous stuff in it. But one of the things that I was thinking at the end when you were bringing in Levinas on suffering, what would you think of the notion of a sense of the suffering of being that is ontological in the way that I try to intend with this notion of the passio ascendi? I bring it in because I think it has a connection with the notion of creation also. That is to say, there's a suffering of being by, let's say, finite creatures like us, because our being, in the first instance, is radically given to be. We are received into being. It's never self-produced. And that's a suffering in a sense. It's not necessarily suffering in the sense of the injurious finitude that we experience in the exposure to the onslaughts of others and so on. But I just bring it in because if there's a suffering of being in that sense, it's not necessarily suffering from the point of view of being an evil, or at least it may be ambiguous, because to be received into being is already to be, as it were, brought into the space of a gift of something that has a goodness for itself. So the suffering of being could be a joy in that more original giveness. And maybe sometimes when we're trying to console or be consoled, we're trying to bring the other or ourselves be opened back into that space of elemental goodness of being, so to say. Just a way of trying to bring the
John, do you want to respond? No, go ahead. William, I can't respond to that rich comment fully. Let me just say one briefly about creation ex nihilo. I feel like I barely had I barely have a grip on this negative ontology in Proclass and Plotinus, but I do think that you raised something very interesting, which is that I think that there's a similar sort of question to be asked of Athanasius and Augustine around creation ex nihilo and what is the sort of troubling ontology of nihil. I can't possibly. I'm neither learned nor smart enough to tackle that right now. I'm not likely to get any smarter, but I still hold out hope that I'll become more learned. But in any case, yes, I think you're right that creation ex nihilo could be plausibly paired with this. John, do you want to respond?
In terms of avoiding the totality and the difference between creator and creation, I see evil as closing that difference, and that's why I was saying it kind of wants to close it, actually. or to forget that there is a difference there. The difference has been, of course, articulated, and Charles, he's been modest now, he knows more about this, in the Greek fathers, in terms of the diastema, the distance that is defining actually that relationship. Also I see a difference that I try to allude to by the end of my paper in how one conceives the one. If you conceive it as an impersonal one, then you can understand why Anaximander, for example, understood being as crime, because it doesn't belong to you, you took it from it. But if you understand the one as a personal one, then it's, the whole scene actually changes. Now it is possible that it was given to you, and therefore existence is a gift to be enjoyed and celebrated. I totally agree with your point of the suffering of the passio essendi, and in terms of suffering, in terms of the passibility, the extreme passivity, which has to receive everything, has to be there. I mean, you have to be passive in that sense in order to actually even come to be. I mean, that would be my comment for now. I don't know if Ellie wants to say more about the last point.
Just as for procedure, I think we finished at 5 minutes to half, and then we have 10 minutes, and we start 5 minutes later with Gabi. Okay?
You finish 5 minutes after half, you mean?
No,
It's 3:22. You want to finish at 3:35 and start at 4:05.
No. Well, if that's okay with you, we finish. I thought that you are in a hurry, so
I'm not in any
okay, then we finish at 3:35, and then we have 10 minutes of
Yes,
rest.
I also have a question.
Okay, well, just thank you for this. This also feel very rich comment. I'm not sure if I'm familiar with this notion of the suffering of being. At least I'm not sure I'm familiar with what you mean when you speak about the suffering of being, or the evil of being. I would say that yes, if there is a fundamental passivity in being, and if man was to live this dimension, then perhaps he would live suffering in another way. But again, in phenomenology, I know and I can relate to. This is exactly the point where man is like, where it's very tricky, because at least philosophy in general and knowledge of science, most Aristotle mostly speaks about the activity of man in being, which would be the very activity of philosophy. So to recover an aspect of passivity would be to link in a very original way, and perhaps that could be a kind of clue. It would be a possibility to link between what you said at the end of your comment, between the goodness of being and suffering in another way, which would, well, not involve the dichotomy between activity and passivity, but which would be completely described or understood in the element of passivity. But I would like to hear about it a lot more, perhaps after. So.
Gabi, and then I have a question.
Yes. This is actually to Professor Manusakis. I have the advantage of having the written text here. It makes one's questions look a little different. And you say, in a work unpublished during his lifetime, a youthful Nietzsche imagines Anaximander addressing beings thus, quote, "Why are you here? Your guilt, I see, causes you to tarry in your existence. With your death, you have to expiate it." And I was thinking two things. First of all, not why with your life you have to expiate it, because the whole question is, that we haven't talked about is if we have one kind of sin or another. We've diagnosed sin and evil all day long, but we have not talked about redemption from sin or expiation from sin, or what all that could be, or how we return from one to the other state. Because if you're in evil in the Plotinian sense, you're never going to get to the good, because you're already defined there. And I must say, I stumbled on this quotation because I thought that death is the end of expiation, not that with your death. So my quarrel is with Nietzsche, not with you. But I would like to, if you have any reactions to that.
Yes, I think Nietzsche understands Anaximander in light of Schopenhauer in this instance. So it's actually a double penalty that beings have to pay. First, to be. life is the first penalty. Then to die, and that's the second penalty. They have to pay twice. It's a double punishment. I think that's the best that one can see it. The idea of the expiation of sin, and that's it. It did something that didn't came up paradoxically not to my paper, and I don't think to any of the papers we heard so far. I don't know why. It's an interesting observation. Yeah.
I have a very okay. So please.
So, just one related question to Ellie's talk. I feel a bit embarrassed. Thank you. I feel a bit embarrassed to defend the Christian tradition here, but or the religious monotheistic religions in general. But I think that from your existentialist perspective, within the Christian tradition, there are strong motives and elements which relate precisely to the problematic you have mentioned. I mean, you dealt mainly with a rationalistic approach, but if we begin with the last words of Jesus, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, I mean, this is precisely, as far as I can understand, the situation of suffering turned into complaint, where the addressee is quite clear, but I think it's very significant that Jesus feels forsaken by God, but he doesn't forsake God himself. That is, he addresses an addressee who has forsaken him. I mean, this is the epitome of the situation of suffering in many ways, and of course the epitome of suffering in the whole Christian tradition. And if one takes a later example, who in fact was the cause for Leibniz's tractate on Theodicy, I mean, the one who evoked Leibniz to write the big study on Theodicy was Pierre Bayle, who has been perhaps on the verge of unbelief, but still, I think, a believer, and has posited precisely the same problem of distance, which can't be really bridged, and the problem of evil and of sin in the after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the expulsion of the Huguenots from France. For him, it was a real trauma that, by 20th century standards, perhaps doesn't seem to be that great, but still was very important and at the time. And for that reason, he is rejecting precisely all the philosophical attempts at explaining evil, and is getting quite close to a dualistic solution, or to a Manichaean solution, seeing evil almost as an independent factor. And it is in response to Bayle that Leibniz writes his Theodicy. And finally, just to say that, to me at least, the most marvelous expression of the dilemma you have described in a very Christian sense is the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. That is, the sense both of alienation and consolation from a very existential point of view.
I love Bach, so I'm happy it evoked those memories in you. But I don't know the piece you are talking about. What was it? I didn't hear it, actually. What of Bach? And the Passion and the Saint Matthäus.
Precisely the, existential
yes. Okay.
The sense of sin and the hopes for consolation.
So I didn't touch upon all those texts in the Christian tradition, from the New Testament to patristics, and I'm aware, even though I don't know them very well, that there is a big literature on it, and I hope one day perhaps I will be able to get to it. So So I just take your comments about Bayle and Leibniz. Of course, that was the problem. I'm not raising a new problem, but the problem is that Leibniz is not giving a satisfactory answer to Bayle. That I would be on the side of Bayle and try to think it in another way.
I have two questions. The first to Charles, a very, very short one. If you could just come back to the idea of evils in the plural, especially if we come back to what you said to conclude your text on evil and God. So if you could just say a little bit more about the idea of many evils. Okay, so go on, because I have also a question to Ellie. So okay, so to Ellie, I have two. The first question is more a remark, which is that in Levinas there's a change from the early text, like being Jewish, where passivity is. I'm continuing the William's question, where Levinas speaks about passivity when he speaks about being, and in later times, I mean, in his later work, passivity he uses the word passivity when he speaks about ethics, beyond being. So there's a very dramatic change of the use of passivity. It's from being to not being, or beyond being. So that's just a remark. If you want to say something, but I just wanted to ask you a question about suffering, because in Levinas, but not only in Levinas, also in Christianity sometimes, and many other places, there's a feeling that you need the suffering of the other to be able to be good. So it's not that evil is the opposite or good or symmetric, you first need evil to be able to react in a good way. And in Levinas it's sometimes very disturbing, this feeling that you need you need to see the suffering on the face on the other in order to sacrifice yourself. I mean, you always sacrifice yourself prior to everything, but you sacrifice yourself because of the suffering of the other. So if you could.
Okay. Right, so Proclass objects to our talking about evil in the singular largely because he thinks that it leads to our thinking, like Plotinus did, that it has a sort of independent absolute existence. And he says, in fact, of course, it only appears in and alongside beings. It's something that infects beings, so we should really only speak about it in the plural. What I find interesting is one could imagine the same argument made with respect to the one. That is to say that the one only appears in its effects, and yet he does not raise an objection to our speaking about the one, though I think that the implication is, so to speak, buried in this passage. With respect to my conclusion, I'm wondering whether one could push this a bit and suggest that, from the perspective of beings, there is no way to distinguish between anything that falls outside of being. That is to say, once you are outside of being, your powers of distinguishing things simply evaporates. And whether to think that's simply a sort of sophistic implication in these different accounts of evil, or whether there's something actually, I don't know, rich in that.
If I may say, it's like the Kantian noumen, the idea that once you're beyond the phenomenon, then if God is in the noumen and evil, then they coalesce into one.
Exactly. Sort of when you're in the noumena, there's no distinctions within the noumena, and I wonder whether that again is a sort of impasse that means that we need to back up because we've made some critical error in our reasoning, or whether there actually isn't something sort of interesting to think with it, in precisely this impasse, or this seeming contradiction that God and evil essentially collapse as that which exceeds being.
About Levinas, I didn't try to speak about Levinas. I just use a phenomenology I find convincing in him in order to develop a line of thought. So I'm not sure it's I agree with you about the switch from the text of the early 40s, 50s, and then the text later about the Ilia and the passivity. So I don't think it's related to the really very discrete phenomenology I try to point out in order to develop some idea about the second point, which is more, I think, close to what I try to do. When you say you need the suffering of the other in order to be good, I found it a very revolting expression, and I don't think it's in Levinas. I don't feel it's in my life too, actually. And in Levinas, if you have the moment, Levinas speaks about the goodness of the face which is in the trace of transcendence, which is a moment of immediate relation to goodness. So I don't think personally in Levinas it's true, and I would even say that perhaps it would be again a kind of Theodiceic reasoning, because you say, well, it's like if you mentioned Kant, it's exactly the Kantian, what is not ethical in Kant is to transform the other into a means and not into a goal. So transforming the suffering of the other into the means in order for me to be good, I feel like I'm Kantian, and I would not accept such a proposition in ethics, at least.
Thank you very much. Thank you. 10 minutes? Okay, so we'll convene.